"Sir, your seat is not up here." Those 6 words would be repeated across an entire airline before the day was over. The departure terminal at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport buzzed with the familiar rhythm of modern travel. Rolling suitcases clicked across polished floors. Flight announcements echoed from overhead speakers. Business travelers hurried toward gates while families searched for charging stations and coffee shops. Near Gate A22, passengers began lining up for boarding on Flight 718 bound for New York City. Among them stood Marcus Reed. At 45 years old, Marcus carried himself with quiet confidence. He wore a dark jacket, simple jeans, and comfortable travel shoes. Nothing about his appearance demanded attention. That was one reason he liked traveling this way. He had spent years building Horizon Capital into one of the largest investment firms in the country, yet he rarely enjoyed being recognized. Today, he wanted nothing more than a peaceful flight and a few uninterrupted hours before an important meeting scheduled for the next morning. As boarding began, Marcus checked his phone briefly before slipping it into his pocket. Several unread emails waited for him. A few messages came from senior executives. One came from an airline board member. He ignored them all for the moment. The flight attendants greeted passengers at the aircraft door while travelers filed into the cabin. Warm lighting illuminated the first-class section. Leather seats stretched along the front rows. Soft music played quietly through hidden speakers. Marcus stepped onto the aircraft and glanced at his boarding pass. Seat 2A. Window. Exactly where he preferred to sit. He moved toward the first-class cabin. Before he reached the row, a voice stopped him. "Excuse me, sir." Marcus turned. A flight attendant stood in the aisle. Her name tag read Lauren Whitmore. She appeared professional and polished, with perfectly arranged hair and a practiced customer service smile. Yet something in her expression seemed uncertain. Her eyes moved from Marcus to the boarding pass in his hand, and then back again. "May I see your ticket?" she asked. Marcus handed it to her without hesitation. Lauren examined it for several seconds. Then she looked toward the economy cabin behind him. "Are you sure this is your seat assignment?" Marcus smiled politely. "That is what the boarding pass says." A few nearby passengers glanced in their direction before returning to their bags and phones. Lauren studied the ticket again. One moment. Marcus waited calmly. He had traveled enough to know mistakes happened. Gate agents entered incorrect information. Seats occasionally changed. None of that bothered him. Lauren stepped aside and checked something on a tablet. Her expression did not soften. Instead, it became more skeptical. Behind Marcus, additional passengers entered the aircraft. The aisle began filling. Some people shifted impatiently. Others watched the interaction with quiet curiosity. Marcus remained relaxed. Through the window beside row 2, afternoon sunlight reflected off the aircraft wing. Engines hummed softly beneath the cabin floor. Everything about the moment felt ordinary. Yet something in Lauren's demeanor suggested the situation was becoming anything but ordinary. She returned and looked directly at Marcus. Then she glanced once more toward the economy cabin. The hesitation in her eyes disappeared. What replaced it would become the first step in a chain of events nobody on that aircraft could have predicted. Lauren handed the boarding pass back without moving aside. The passengers entering behind Marcus were now slowing noticeably as the aisle narrowed near the entrance to first class. A businessman holding a briefcase glanced over Marcus's shoulder. A woman carrying a designer handbag paused beside the galley. The quiet curiosity in the cabin began growing. Lauren folded her hands professionally. "Sir, I think there may have been an error." Marcus accepted the boarding pass and looked down at it again. Seat 2A remained printed clearly in bold letters. "What kind of error?" he asked calmly. Lauren lowered her voice slightly, though not enough to prevent nearby passengers from hearing. Passengers assigned to first class usually receive special boarding designation verification. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And mine does not." Lauren hesitated. "I would like to double-check with the gate." The statement sounded reasonable on the surface, but something beneath it felt different. Marcus noticed it immediately. Years of negotiations had taught him to recognize when people were asking questions and when they were making assumptions. He slipped the boarding pass into his jacket pocket. "Of course," he said. "Take whatever time you need." His calm response seemed to surprise her. Lauren stepped toward the front galley and spoke quietly into a phone connected to the gate desk. While she waited, Marcus remained standing beside row 2. Through the cabin windows, Airport vehicles moved across the tarmac under bright afternoon sunlight. The aircraft smelled faintly of fresh coffee and leather. Around him, passengers settled into wide seats and stored carry-on bags. Several continued watching the situation. Lauren returned after a brief conversation. Her expression had become even firmer. "Sir, would you mind stepping aside for a moment while we continue boarding?" Marcus glanced toward the first-class seat only a few feet away. Then he looked at Lauren. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" "We are simply verifying information." The answer sounded rehearsed. Marcus nodded politely and stepped toward the galley entrance. More passengers entered the aircraft. The line continued moving. A few people glanced at Marcus before taking their seats. Others openly stared. The feeling was subtle but familiar. He had experienced it before. Not often, not recently, but enough times to recognize it. Lauren welcomed each arriving first-class passenger with a warm smile. Some received immediate assistance with luggage. Others were personally escorted to their seats. Marcus watched quietly from the side. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Boarding continued. Finally, Marcus approached again. "Has the verification been completed?" Lauren looked up from her tablet. "Not yet." Marcus remained polite. "The boarding door closes soon." Lauren's eyes briefly moved across his simple clothing before returning to the screen. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Passengers like you are usually seated farther back." The words were spoken softly, yet they seemed louder than any announcement in the cabin. A nearby passenger looked up immediately. Another froze while placing a bag into the overhead compartment. Marcus felt the silence spread around him. Lauren appeared to realize what she had said only after the words had left her mouth. But instead of correcting herself, she continued studying the tablet. Marcus stood perfectly still. Then he slowly nodded once. "I see," he replied. His voice never rose. His expression never changed. Yet somewhere deep inside the aircraft, a test had just begun, and nobody on board understood who was actually being evaluated. The words lingered in the air long after Lauren returned her attention to the tablet. Around the first-class cabin, several passengers suddenly found reasons to focus very intensely on their phones. Others stared out the windows. A few exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nobody wanted to become part of the situation. Marcus understood that instinct. Silence was often easier than involvement. He slipped one hand into his jacket pocket and looked calmly toward seat 2A. The leather chair remained empty, waiting, reserved in his name. Yet somehow it felt farther away than ever. Lauren continued tapping information into her device. Her posture suggested the conversation was over. Marcus did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood near the galley while boarding continued. One passenger after another entered the aircraft. A silver-haired businessman paused beside Lauren. "Can I help with something?" he asked politely, glancing toward Marcus. Lauren offered a professional smile. "Just resolving a seating issue." The businessman nodded and continued into the cabin. Marcus noticed the wording. Seating issue. Not verification issue. Not system issue. A seating issue implied uncertainty about where he belonged. 20 minutes earlier, the flight had seemed ordinary. Now every passing minute felt strangely revealing. Near the entrance, a younger flight attendant emerged from the rear galley carrying several bottles of water. Her name tag read Emily Carter. She appeared to be in her late 20s. As she approached, she noticed Marcus standing beside the entrance and glanced toward the empty first-class seat. Confusion briefly crossed her face. "Is everything okay?" she asked quietly. Before Marcus could answer, Lauren responded. "We are handling it." Emily hesitated. Something about the situation seemed odd to her. The passenger was calm. The boarding pass was clearly visible in his hand. The first-class seat remained empty. Yet she sensed it was not her place to question a senior crew member in front of passengers. "All right," she said softly. Still, as she walked away, she glanced back once more. Marcus noticed that too. Several more minutes passed. The boarding line grew shorter. Flight attendants began closing overhead bins. A recorded announcement welcomed passengers aboard and reminded them to store electronic devices before departure. The aircraft was nearly ready to leave the gate. Marcus checked the time. Then he checked his phone. A new message had arrived. Another from a board member. Another from corporate leadership. He read the notifications briefly before locking the screen. None of it showed on his face. Nearby, Lauren finally looked up again. "Sir, for now I am going to ask you to take a temporary seat in row 28 while we continue reviewing this matter." Marcus stared at her for a moment. Row 28 was deep inside economy, nearly 30 feet away from the seat printed on his boarding pass. Several nearby passengers heard the instruction. The businessman who had spoken earlier frowned slightly. Emily froze near the galley entrance. Even she appeared surprised this time. Marcus slowly folded the boarding pass once and slipped it back into his pocket. "You would like me to leave my assigned seat area and move to row 28? Lauren nodded. Temporarily. The cabin grew noticeably quieter. Marcus looked toward the empty seat beside the window, then toward the passengers watching from nearby rows. Finally, he nodded. "If that is your request." Lauren seemed relieved. She gestured toward the rear of the aircraft. As Marcus turned and began walking toward economy, dozens of eyes followed him. What nobody realized was that the farther he walked from seat 2A, the closer everyone aboard was moving toward a truth that would soon change the entire flight. Marcus walked slowly through the aircraft, passing row after row of occupied seats. The farther he moved from the front cabin, the more uncomfortable the atmosphere became. Some passengers looked away when he passed. Others watched openly. A mother seated near row 14 tightened her grip on a paperback book while following the situation with concerned eyes. A teenager removed one earbud and whispered something to his father. Nobody understood why a passenger holding a valid first-class boarding pass was being sent toward the back of the aircraft. Marcus reached row 28 and found the temporary seat Lauren had assigned. It was a middle seat between two strangers. He placed his carry-on beneath the seat in front of him and sat down without complaint. The aircraft cabin vibrated softly as ground crews completed preparations outside. Through a nearby window, baggage carts rolled across the tarmac under the afternoon sun. Marcus folded his hands and remained silent. A few rows ahead, Emily continued her service checks. Every few minutes her eyes drifted toward row 28. Something about the entire situation bothered her. She had worked for the airline long enough to recognize normal seating disputes. This did not feel like one. The passenger had never argued. He had never raised his voice. Most importantly, nobody had actually explained what was wrong with his ticket. Near the front of the aircraft, Lauren completed final boarding procedures. The boarding door remained open for only a few more minutes. She reviewed her tablet once again, searching for justification she could confidently stand behind. Yet every system entry showed the same thing. Seat 2A. Confirmed. First class. Fully paid. She frowned. Somehow that irritated her more than reassured her. Meanwhile, Marcus received another notification on his phone. Then another. The screen briefly illuminated with messages from executives, attorneys, and board members. He glanced at them before placing the phone face down on the tray table. The older gentleman seated beside him noticed the flood of incoming messages. "Busy day?" he asked politely. Marcus smiled. "You could say that." The man chuckled. "You do not seem very upset for someone who just lost a first-class seat." Marcus looked toward the front of the aircraft. "Sometimes people tell you more about themselves than they realize." The older man considered that answer for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. Across the cabin, Emily approached with a bottle of water. She stopped beside Marcus's row. "Sir, can I get you anything before departure?" Her voice carried genuine kindness. Marcus accepted the water with a grateful smile. "Thank you." Emily hesitated. Then she lowered her voice. "For what it is worth, I am sorry this has happened." Marcus studied her expression. There was no agenda there. No performance. Just sincerity. "I appreciate that," he said. Emily smiled and continued down the aisle. A few minutes later, the boarding door finally closed. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. An announcement welcomed passengers aboard and introduced the flight crew. Around the aircraft, seat belts clicked into place. Yet near the front galley, Lauren suddenly received a message that caused her expression to change. She read it once. Then again. The color slowly drained from her face. For the first time since Marcus stepped onto the aircraft, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Lauren stared at the message on her tablet as the aircraft pushed back from the gate. Outside the windows, the terminal slowly drifted away while airport vehicles moved like tiny machines beneath the afternoon sun. Around the cabin, passengers settled into their seats and prepared for departure. Yet Lauren's attention remained fixed on the screen in front of her. The message had come from a supervisor at the gate. It contained only a few lines. The verification she had requested was complete. Seat 2A belonged to Marcus Reed. The ticket was valid. The payment was verified. The reservation had never been flagged. There was no error, no discrepancy, no reason for him to be sitting in row 28. Lauren read the information again, then once more. The realization should have prompted an immediate correction. Instead, something inside her resisted. She glanced toward the rear of the aircraft. Marcus sat quietly in the middle seat she had assigned him. He was speaking softly with the older gentleman beside him. There was no anger, no confrontation, no complaint. Somehow that made her feel even more unsettled. Nearby, Emily noticed Lauren's expression. "Everything okay?" she asked. Lauren locked the tablet screen. "Fine." The answer came too quickly. Emily frowned slightly, but said nothing. Moments later, the aircraft began taxiing toward the runway. The captain welcomed everyone aboard and announced an expected flight time of 3 hours and 15 minutes. Engines hummed louder beneath the cabin floor. Seatbelt signs illuminated overhead. Marcus leaned back in the narrow seat and looked through the window across the aisle. The skyline of Dallas shimmered in the distance. Beside him, the older passenger smiled. "You know, most people would be demanding compensation by now." Marcus chuckled softly. "Most people are probably smarter than I am." The man laughed. "I doubt that." Several rows ahead, a young mother struggled to place a diaper bag beneath her seat while holding a restless toddler. Before she could ask for help, Marcus stood and carefully assisted her. The woman thanked him with visible relief. He returned to his seat as though the gesture required no attention at all. Emily noticed. So did several passengers nearby. Lauren noticed as well. The contrast bothered her more than she expected. She had spent nearly 30 minutes treating him as a problem. Yet every person who interacted with him seemed to have a positive experience. As the aircraft reached the runway, Marcus's phone vibrated once more. A name flashed briefly across the screen before he silenced the device. Emily happened to catch a glimpse while passing by. Her eyes widened slightly. She recognized the company listed in the email signature. Horizon Capital, one of the largest investment firms in the country. She looked at Marcus again, then at the phone, then back at Marcus. A question began forming in her mind. The aircraft accelerated down the runway. Passengers pressed gently into their seats as the jet climbed into the sky. Clouds drifted past the windows in brilliant white layers. The city below grew smaller with every second. 20 minutes later, the seatbelt sign switched off. Service preparations began throughout the cabin. Lauren opened her tablet once again. This time a second message appeared from airline headquarters. Unlike the first one, this message included a bright red priority banner. As she read the opening sentence, her heart skipped a beat. Someone important was asking about a passenger named Marcus Reed. Very important. 30,000 feet above the ground, the aircraft settled into smooth, cruising altitude. Sunlight poured through the cabin windows, turning the clouds outside into endless fields of white and gold. Most passengers relaxed into their routines. Laptops opened. Movies began playing. Flight attendants prepared beverage service. Yet near the front galley, tension quietly continued building. Lauren stood alone reading the priority message for a third time. The sender was not a supervisor. It was a vice president from airline headquarters. The wording was unusually direct. Headquarters wanted immediate confirmation regarding the status and treatment of a passenger named Marcus Reed. Lauren felt a small knot tighten in her stomach. Airlines handled thousands of passengers every day. Individual inquiries from executives were rare. Requests marked urgent from senior leadership were even rarer. She glanced toward the rear of the aircraft again. Marcus sat calmly in row 28, speaking with the elderly gentleman beside him. He looked completely unconcerned. That made even less sense. Most passengers would have demanded explanations. Some would have threatened complaints. Others would have documented everything on social media. Marcus had done none of those things. Emily approached, carrying service supplies. "You look worried," she said quietly. Lauren showed her only the top portion of the message. Emily read enough to understand. Her eyes widened immediately. Why would headquarters be asking about him? Lauren shook her head. "I do not know." But deep down she suspected the answer might be something she did not want to hear. Beverage service began. Emily moved through economy offering drinks and snacks. When she reached row 28, she smiled warmly. "Would you like something to drink?" Marcus glanced up from a book he had been reading. "Coffee, please." Emily handed him the cup. Then she hesitated. May I ask you something? Marcus smiled. You may. Emily lowered her voice. Did you travel for business? The question sounded harmless, but both of them understood it carried another meaning. Marcus considered her for a moment before answering. Business never seems very far away. Emily laughed softly. That sounds like a yes. Marcus returned the smile. That sounds like a reasonable conclusion. As she continued down the aisle, Emily found herself even more curious. Something about him felt familiar. Not his face exactly. His presence. The way people listened when he spoke. The calm confidence. The complete absence of ego. Back near the galley, Lauren received another notification. This time it was not a message. It was a request for a direct call from the cockpit. Her pulse quickened. The captain rarely interrupted cabin operations unless something required immediate attention. She knocked on the cockpit door and entered a moment later. The captain turned in his seat, holding a printed manifest. Lauren, he said carefully, I need clarification regarding a passenger. Her stomach dropped before he even said the name. Marcus Reed. The captain looked surprised. Yes. Silence filled the small cockpit for a moment. Outside the windshield, bright clouds stretched to the horizon. Finally, the captain lowered the manifest. Headquarters has contacted us twice in the last 15 minutes. Lauren felt the blood drain from her face. The captain studied her expression. Then he asked a question that suddenly made everything feel much more serious. Can you explain why a confirmed first-class passenger is currently sitting in row 28? Lauren felt every word land heavier than the last. The cockpit suddenly seemed much smaller. The captain waited patiently for an explanation while clouds drifted peacefully beyond the windshield. For several seconds, she struggled to answer. There was a concern about the reservation, she finally said. The captain glanced down at the printed manifest. Headquarters verified the reservation over 30 minutes ago. Lauren swallowed. I wanted to be cautious. The captain studied her expression. He had spent decades working in aviation and had learned to recognize when facts and assumptions were not the same thing. Was there an actual issue with the ticket? He asked. Lauren said nothing. That silence answered the question more clearly than words could have. Back in the cabin, Marcus remained seated in row 28. The elderly passenger beside him had fallen asleep. Across the aisle, a young boy stared out the window at the endless sea of clouds. The atmosphere around Marcus felt remarkably normal considering everything that had happened. He opened his book again and continued reading. Every few minutes, someone glanced toward him. The curiosity throughout the cabin was growing. Emily returned from the rear galley carrying empty cups. As she passed Marcus's row, she noticed the title of the book resting in his hands. It was not a novel. It was a leadership book often recommended in executive development programs. Several passages were highlighted. Notes filled the margins. Emily slowed her pace. That is not exactly vacation reading, she said with a smile. Marcus laughed softly. Old habits. Emily hesitated before asking another question. Do you work in management? Marcus closed the book carefully. Something like that. The answer only deepened her curiosity. Before she could continue, the intercom chimed overhead. A flight attendant was being requested in the cockpit. Emily continued down the aisle while Marcus returned to reading. A few rows ahead, passengers whispered quietly among themselves. The unusual seating situation had become impossible to ignore. Near the front of the aircraft, Lauren exited the cockpit looking visibly shaken. The captain followed a few moments later. He walked directly to the first-class cabin and stopped beside seat 2A. The seat remained empty, reserved, waiting. He looked toward Lauren. That passenger belongs here. His voice was calm but firm. Several first-class travelers overheard the statement. One woman lowered her newspaper. A businessman removed his headphones. Lauren nodded. I understand. Yet she still did not move. The captain's expression tightened slightly. Then why is he not sitting here? Before Lauren could answer, her tablet vibrated again. Another priority message from headquarters. This one contained a direct instruction. Contact the passenger immediately. Confirm his comfort and accommodation. Notify the captain once complete. Lauren stared at the screen. Her hands suddenly felt cold. Somewhere far above the clouds, events were beginning to move beyond her control. Meanwhile, Marcus received a phone notification of his own. Unlike the others, this one made him pause. He read the message carefully before slipping the phone back into his pocket. His expression never changed, but a small smile briefly appeared. It lasted less than a second. Emily happened to see it from across the aisle. Whatever was happening, she realized, it was much bigger than a seat assignment. And within the next few minutes, the entire aircraft would begin discovering exactly how big. The aircraft cruised steadily through the afternoon sky, while tension quietly spread through the cabin like an invisible current. Most passengers remained unaware of the messages moving back and forth between airline headquarters and the flight deck. They saw only fragments. An empty first-class seat. A passenger sitting in economy. A crew member who suddenly looked nervous. Yet those fragments were beginning to form a larger picture. Lauren stood near the front galley reading the latest instruction from headquarters. Contact the passenger immediately. Confirm accommodation. Provide update to executive operations. Executive operations. The phrase echoed in her mind. Airlines did not involve executive operations because of ordinary seating complaints. Something was wrong. Or perhaps something had been wrong from the very beginning. Emily approached carrying service paperwork. They keep asking about him, do they not? She asked quietly. Lauren hesitated before nodding. Emily looked toward the rear of the cabin. Marcus was helping the young boy across the aisle solve a puzzle from an activity booklet. The child laughed at something Marcus said. His mother smiled appreciatively. There was nothing intimidating about him. Nothing demanding. Nothing entitled. I still do not understand why he was moved, Emily said softly. Lauren did not answer, because the truth sounded increasingly difficult to defend, even to herself. Finally, she took a deep breath and began walking toward row 28. Several passengers watched her approach. Marcus noticed her coming but remained seated. The young boy returned to his coloring pages while Marcus closed the activity booklet and set it aside. Lauren stopped beside his seat. For a moment, she seemed unsure how to begin. Mr. Reed, she said carefully. May I speak with you? Marcus looked up. Of course. His calmness, somehow, made the conversation harder. Lauren lowered her voice. It appears there may have been a misunderstanding regarding your seating assignment. A faint smile crossed Marcus's face. May have been. Lauren felt heat rise into her cheeks. Several nearby passengers were now openly listening. Your first-class reservation has been confirmed. Marcus nodded. I never doubted it. The elderly gentleman beside him hid a small smile. Lauren continued. We would like to move you to your assigned seat. The words hung in the air. Passengers nearby exchanged glances. The young mother across the aisle looked up from her tablet. Even the little boy stopped coloring. Marcus considered the offer for several seconds. Then he looked toward the front of the aircraft. The seat is still available? Lauren nodded immediately. Yes. Marcus glanced back at her. Interesting. There was no sarcasm in his voice. No anger. Just observation. Lauren felt somehow more uncomfortable than she would have if he had criticized her. Before either could continue, Emily appeared beside them. Mr. Reed, she said, slightly out of breath. The captain would like to speak with you when convenient. Silence swept through the surrounding rows. The captain? Several passengers looked up immediately. Lauren's eyes widened. That request had not been part of the message she received. Marcus remained calm. Is there a problem? Emily shook her head. No, sir. Quite the opposite. Then her voice softened. Headquarters has been trying to reach the flight deck about you for nearly an hour. For the first time all afternoon, genuine curiosity spread across the cabin. And somewhere near the front of the aircraft, an even bigger revelation was already making its way through airline headquarters. The request from the captain changed the atmosphere immediately. What had begun as a simple seating dispute was no longer confined to a few rows of passengers. People throughout the surrounding section were paying attention now. The young mother across the aisle looked up from her tablet. The elderly gentleman beside Marcus adjusted his glasses. Even passengers several rows away leaned slightly into the aisle, pretending not to listen while hearing every word. Marcus stood calmly from row 28. If the captain would like to speak with me, I would be happy to do so. Emily smiled with visible relief. Lauren remained beside him, uncertain whether she should say anything else. She had already invited him back to first class. Now the captain wanted a conversation. Every minute seemed to bring a new development she could not explain. As Marcus stepped into the aisle, the aircraft hummed steadily around them. Outside the windows, brilliant white clouds stretched endlessly beneath a blue sky. Inside, dozens of eyes quietly followed him toward the front of the cabin. When they reached the galley, the captain was waiting. He had left the cockpit briefly and stood near the entrance to first class. The moment he saw Marcus, his posture changed noticeably. Not dramatically, respectfully. "Mr. Reed," he said, "thank you for your patience." Marcus extended his hand. The captain shook it immediately. Lauren noticed the interaction and felt another wave of unease. The captain continued, "I would like to apologize for the confusion regarding your seat assignment." Marcus nodded politely. "I appreciate that." The captain glanced toward seat 2A. "The seat remains available if you would like to move." Marcus looked at the empty chair. Sunlight spilled across the leather seat through the nearby window. It had remained vacant for nearly the entire flight. Then he looked back at the captain. "Before I decide, may I ask what prompted the sudden concern?" The captain hesitated only briefly. "Airline headquarters contacted us directly." Several nearby passengers overheard the statement. A businessman seated in first class lowered his laptop screen. Lauren's eyes widened slightly. "Headquarters. Not customer service. Not gate operations. Headquarters." The captain continued. "Multiple executives requested immediate confirmation of your comfort and accommodations." Silence settled over the front cabin. Marcus smiled faintly. "That sounds like them." The answer raised even more questions than it solved. Emily happened to glance toward Marcus's phone as it illuminated again on the nearby counter. This time she caught more than a company name. An incoming message preview appeared briefly before the screen dimmed. "Board meeting rescheduled until your arrival." Emily froze. Her eyes moved from the message to Marcus, then back again. The realization hit her all at once. Horizon Capital. Executive Communications. Board meetings waiting on his schedule. Suddenly, everything began fitting together. Lauren noticed Emily's expression immediately. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Emily looked toward Marcus. Then she lowered her voice even further. "I think we have been asking the wrong question all day." Lauren frowned. "What do you mean?" Emily swallowed. "The question is not why headquarters is calling about him." She glanced once more at the phone screen. "The question is who exactly Marcus Reed is." At that exact moment, another priority message arrived on Lauren's tablet. The sender this time was not merely a vice president. It came directly from the office of the airline's chief executive officer. And the first sentence caused her heart to stop for a beat. "Please ensure Mr. Reed receives our highest level of accommodation. He is one of our most important strategic partners." For several seconds, nobody spoke. The message on Lauren's tablet seemed to drain all sound from the front of the aircraft. "One of our most important strategic partners." The words stared back at her from the screen while the aircraft continued smoothly through the afternoon sky. The captain read the message over her shoulder. His expression immediately became more serious. Emily looked from one face to another, realizing that whatever Marcus Reed's true role was, it reached far beyond an ordinary business traveler. Meanwhile, Marcus remained remarkably calm. He glanced once toward the first-class seat and then toward the clouds outside the cabin windows. It was almost as though he had expected none of this to surprise him. The captain finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed, would you mind joining me for a moment?" Marcus nodded. The captain guided him toward the front galley. Several first-class passengers openly watched now. Curiosity had replaced indifference. The businessman with the laptop. The woman with the newspaper. Even passengers across the aisle quietly listened. Once they reached the galley, the captain lowered his voice. "Sir, headquarters has been attempting to contact us regarding your flight experience." Marcus smiled faintly. "I gathered as much." The captain hesitated. "May I ask what relationship you have with the airline?" Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he answered with the same calm tone he had used throughout the flight. "My company has worked closely with your leadership team for several years." The captain nodded slowly. "Horizon Capital." Marcus smiled. "Yes." Emily felt her pulse quicken. She knew that name. Nearly everyone in corporate America knew that name. Horizon Capital managed billions of dollars in investments across transportation, technology, infrastructure, and aviation. Suddenly, the pieces began fitting together. The board meeting message. The executive communications. Headquarters calling repeatedly. Lauren stood frozen. The realization was beginning to form in her mind as well. Then her tablet vibrated again. Another message arrived. This time it included a briefing document. She opened it automatically. The first photograph on the screen caused her breath to catch. It was Marcus, not seated in row 28, not standing beside the boarding door. A professional corporate portrait. Dark suit, confident expression, Behind him appeared the Horizon Capital logo. Beneath the photograph was a title, Chief Executive Officer. Lauren stared at the screen, then at Marcus, then back again. The distance between the two images seemed impossible to reconcile, yet they were unquestionably the same person. Emily saw the photograph and covered her mouth. The captain slowly exhaled. At last, the mystery was gone. Marcus Reed was not merely a strategic partner. He was the CEO of one of the largest investment firms in the country, a company currently involved in discussions that could influence the airline's future growth plans for years. Lauren felt every decision from earlier that day rush back into her mind. The questions, the assumptions, the comments, the seat reassignment. Most painful of all was the sentence she could still hear clearly. Passengers like you are usually seated farther back. Marcus noticed the expression on her face. Yet there was no satisfaction in his eyes. No triumph. Only quiet disappointment. The kind that carried far more weight than anger ever could. Outside the windows, sunlight stretched across the clouds in brilliant gold. Inside the aircraft, a revelation had finally arrived. But the most important consequences were only beginning. The revelation spread through the aircraft faster than any announcement could have. It moved from whispered conversations in the front cabin to curious glances farther back. Passengers did not know every detail, but they knew enough. The man who had been removed from his assigned first-class seat was not an ordinary traveler, and the flight crew knew it. Lauren stood near the galley holding the tablet that displayed Marcus's executive profile. The photograph seemed impossible to ignore. Chief Executive Officer, Horizon Capital. Her eyes lingered on the title while memories from earlier replayed one after another. The boarding pass she questioned, the assumptions she made, the seat she took away, the sentence she wished she could erase. Across from her, Marcus remained composed. Nothing about his posture had changed since the moment he boarded the aircraft. That consistency somehow made the contrast even more powerful. The captain finally broke the silence. Mr. Reed, I owe you an apology. Marcus nodded politely. I appreciate that. The captain looked genuinely troubled. You purchased a first-class ticket. You were entitled to the seat. That should have been the end of the discussion. Marcus glanced toward the empty chair near the window. It could have been. The simple answer carried more weight than a speech ever could. Emily stood quietly nearby. The longer she observed Marcus, the more she understood why people trusted him with enormous responsibilities. He never demanded respect, yet somehow respect followed him anyway. Lauren finally found her voice. Mr. Reed. The words caught in her throat. For a moment, she seemed unsure how to continue. I made assumptions I should not have made. Marcus looked at her calmly. She lowered her eyes. And I treated you unfairly. The aircraft hummed softly around them. Outside, sunlight illuminated vast stretches of cloud. Inside, every person within earshot seemed frozen in place. Lauren took a slow breath. I am sorry. Marcus studied her expression. Unlike earlier, there was no confidence in her voice now. No certainty. Only honesty. And perhaps regret. He nodded once. Thank you for saying that. Lauren looked surprised. She had expected anger. Criticism. Something. Instead, she received a response so measured it made her feel even worse. The captain glanced toward the cockpit. His tablet had just received another message from headquarters. He opened it quickly. This time the communication came directly from the office of the airline's chief executive officer. The captain read the message and then looked up at Marcus. Sir, headquarters would like to speak with you personally after we land. Marcus smiled faintly. I expected they might. Emily noticed something else in the message summary. A phrase that caught her attention immediately. Strategic Investment Review. Her eyes widened. Horizon Capital was not merely doing business with the airline. Something much larger was happening. The captain noticed her reaction. He read farther into the message and felt his own expression change. Lauren saw it too. What is it? She asked quietly. The captain looked from the screen to Marcus, then back again. Horizon Capital is leading a multi-billion-dollar investment initiative involving the airline. Silence returned. Lauren felt her stomach drop. The implications were impossible to ignore. Yet Marcus remained focused on something entirely different. Not the investment. Not the influence. Not the power. He looked out the window toward the sunlight resting across the clouds. And in that moment, everyone around him began realizing the most important lesson of the flight had never been about who he was. It was about how he had been treated before anyone knew. The remainder of the flight felt different. Not because Marcus had revealed who he was, but because everyone around him had begun seeing themselves more clearly. The captain returned to the cockpit. Emily resumed her duties. Lauren remained near the front galley, watching passengers move through ordinary moments that suddenly seemed far more significant. A businessman accepted a cup of coffee. A child laughed at a cartoon playing on a tablet. A couple discussed their plans after landing. Simple interactions. Yet Lauren found herself wondering how many assumptions people carried into those moments every day. Marcus eventually accepted the captain's invitation to return to seat 2A. As he settled beside the window, sunlight washed across the cabin in warm shades of gold. The clouds below resembled an endless ocean stretching beyond the horizon. Several first-class passengers quietly greeted him as he sat down. Their smiles were respectful. Some appeared embarrassed for having watched the earlier events without speaking. Marcus acknowledged each of them with the same calm courtesy he had shown all day. No resentment, no performance, just dignity. About 40 minutes before landing, the captain made another trip into the cabin. This time he approached Marcus directly. "Mr. Reed, headquarters asked me to pass along a message." Marcus closed the report he had been reviewing. "Go ahead." The captain smiled slightly. "The executive team would like to meet with you immediately upon arrival." Marcus nodded. "I will make time." The captain hesitated. "There is one more thing." Marcus waited. The airline's chief executive officer personally requested a review of everything that occurred today. Lauren overheard the statement from several feet away. Her shoulders tensed. Yet before anxiety could fully settle in, Marcus spoke. That review should focus on the process, not individuals. The captain looked surprised. "Sir." Marcus glanced toward the aisle. "Systems create habits. Habits create outcomes. If something needs improvement, it should be improved." Lauren slowly looked up. For the first time since the revelation, genuine confusion crossed her face. Marcus was being handed every opportunity to demand punishment. Instead, he was talking about solutions. Emily noticed it too. She smiled quietly. The aircraft began its gradual descent toward New York. Outside the windows, scattered clouds gave way to city lights emerging in the distance. The cabin lights dimmed softly. Passengers organized bags and returned tray tables to their upright positions. The familiar rhythm of arrival filled the aircraft. Yet an unusual sense of reflection lingered in the air. Before taking her jump seat, Lauren approached Marcus one final time. She seemed nervous. "Mr. Reed." He looked up. "Yes." She took a breath. "Thank you for showing more grace than I deserve today." Marcus considered her words carefully. Then he smiled. People learn more from honesty than from humiliation. Lauren felt her eyes lower. Those words would remain with her long after the flight ended. As the aircraft descended through the evening sky, city lights sparkled beneath the wings like scattered stars. The landing gear extended with a familiar mechanical hum. Passengers prepared for arrival. Yet the most important destination of the day had never been New York. It had been a moment of understanding. And for several people aboard that aircraft, they were only now beginning to arrive there. The aircraft touched down just after sunset. Tires met the runway with a gentle jolt, followed by the steady roar of reverse thrust. Outside the windows, rows of lights stretched across the airport like glowing pathways guiding travelers home. Inside the cabin, passengers began gathering their belongings, but the mood felt different from an ordinary arrival. Conversations were quieter. Thoughts seemed heavier. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Marcus remained seated beside the window. Golden reflections from the terminal lights drifted across the glass. He watched them silently. Across the aisle, a businessman who had observed much of the day's events finally spoke. "Sir, I learned something today." Marcus looked over. The man smiled faintly. "I am glad I did." Marcus nodded politely. No speech was necessary. A few minutes later, the seatbelt sign switched off. Passengers stood and reached for luggage. The familiar sounds of arrival filled the cabin. Overhead bins opened. Suitcases rolled forward. Yet before anyone could leave, the captain stepped out of the cockpit one final time. He walked directly toward Marcus. "Mr. Reed." Marcus stood. The captain extended his hand. "Thank you for your patience today." Marcus shook it warmly. "Thank you for your professionalism." Nearby passengers watched the exchange. Then Emily approached. Her smile carried genuine respect. "Safe travels, sir." Marcus smiled back. Keep doing exactly what you did today. The world needs more of it. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. Those words meant more than any corporate recognition ever could. Finally, Lauren stepped forward. For a moment, she seemed uncertain whether she belonged there at all. Then she met Marcus's eyes. I will remember this day for a very long time. Marcus studied her expression. The arrogance that had existed earlier was gone. In its place stood humility, reflection, growth. So will I, he replied gently. The boarding door opened. Passengers began leaving the aircraft. One by one they passed through the cabin, many glancing toward Marcus before stepping into the jet bridge. Not because of his title, not because of his company, because they had witnessed something rare. A person given every opportunity to seek revenge who instead chose dignity. When Marcus finally stepped into the terminal, several airline executives were already waiting near the gate. Their expressions were serious. Important meetings would follow. Reviews would take place. Policies would be examined. Careers might change. Yet none of that occupied Marcus's thoughts. As he walked through the terminal, he passed a large window overlooking the runway. Aircraft lights shimmered against the dark evening sky. For a moment he stopped and looked out. He thought about the empty seat, the assumptions, the apology, the lesson. Then he smiled softly and continued walking. Behind him, somewhere inside that aircraft, a crew member was rethinking how she saw people. A young flight attendant was learning the value of speaking up. Dozens of passengers were carrying a new perspective home with them. Marcus never looked back. He did not need to. The most important victory had never been reclaiming a first-class seat. It had been proving that character reveals itself long before titles do. And as the lights of the airport reflected across the glass, one truth remained brighter than all the rest. They judged him by where they thought he belonged. In the end, he reminded them that every person deserves respect before anyone knows who they are.